My next guest, you may have noticed her from ESPN Radio Studios a couple years ago, or actually Truth Radio, episode number 39. Ladies and gentlemen, from the Black Panther, Ronza Rafo, ladies and gentlemen, Ronza Rafo. Come on in. Here we go, Ronza. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Come on, please have a seat. Isn't it comfortable?
Jesse. Thank you for that lovely intro.
Nice to meet you.
Loved it.
That's for the live part of the show, because the truth is, gang, we're actually going to be spending the rest of our time talking about a little bit more of a serious topic. It's a topic that probably isn't going to show up at the holiday table.
Definitely not.
And in order to have that level of conversation, we had to get our show extraordinaire expert, Ronza Rafo, of course, from Rafo Law.
Thank you
So much for coming back in and making us a little bit smarter. So the discussion that we got to have has to do with something that Ronza and I both experience in our own professional accord, and it's a conversation that seems to not take place early enough, meaning that by the time we're getting wind of that conversation, it's so far downstream that it's difficult for us professionally to be able to unravel the stuff maybe that's already sort of been done, right?
Right.
Maybe good if they're lucky, but usually it's the other part of that unfortunate conversation. It's not done well, and then we're kind of left to sort of fix all the problems, and then you're left with kind of you get what you get at that point. And it's the issue of, hey, we were married, at one point in time things were going well. They didn't anymore end up that way. It's maybe 50% of the folks that go down that path end up this way. And then you add on some of the integrated complexities, like, for example, do you have a house, right? So we're calling this one, who gets the house, right? So let's say you're divorcing and you own some property together, and sure, maybe the house is what the conversation starts with. But there's so much more that has to get unraveled in order to have the entirety of the conversation. And it's the so much more part, oftentimes, that ends up reverse engineering back to the house discussion in the first place. So we broke this up for you guys, and we're calling it the 12 questions that absolutely must be answered if you are splitting up, you're going through divorce, you happen to own some property before a sign ever goes in the front yard. So categorically speaking, it seems as though everybody seems to want to know, like, who wins and who loses, right? Like, that's a big part of it. The speed. This is something maybe you don't really think about until you kind of get into the granularity of it, but usually one person wants it to go really fast. We'll talk about that. The other person maybe not so much, and how this kind of comes and butts up heads in the process of the real estate transaction. How about kids, right? Seeing the kids or no kids at all for you, right? This is a big part of it. How about control? Either feeling like you have some of it through the process or feeling no control whatsoever. And then lastly, the ability to be proactive versus being reactive, right? So those are the 6 tenets for me. Ronza, let's get started with the elephant in the room, the win or lose, right? So you're in the conversation, who gets the house? Everybody wants to feel like they've won, right? So how do you manage and navigate those troubled waters?
Well, first, I always tell everybody, there is no real winning or losing. It's compromising. Family law, divorce, it's just a matter of compromising. So the first most common thing that always comes up is you have a situation where there's a marriage and one spouse has been paying the mortgage either throughout the whole marriage or post-separation or at some part of the marriage. What it's going to come down to, and we're focusing on the state of California, right, is whether the property is community property or separate property. That comes down to, when was the house purchased?
Right.
Was it purchased during,
right,
before?
Well, and it's even more complicated than that, too, because let's say that somebody actually bought the house before they got married, but then they got married, and then they had the house together while they were married.
Right. There are formulas that the state of California uses. We're not going to go into them, but it basically takes how much of the down payment the separate spouse paid before the marriage. They're going to get reimbursed for that off the top, right? And then how much of the principal was paid down with community funds. Now, here's a little caveat here. People always ask me, well, hold on. Yeah. I'm the one that was paying and working throughout like 20 years of marriage. She was a stay-at-home mom. She never worked. So it's not community funds.
Right.
Every dime you earn while you're married, unless there's some other writing stating otherwise, is community property. So those mortgage payments you were making, that's community funds.
Right. And the other thing being like a prenup or something like that. And the good news is that good that's the case, right? Because I mean, you got to imagine how many people are in that situation feeling that loss of control or power. We'll talk about that later.
Right.
But, you know, that role is just as critical because they're saying, hey, I'm the one that raised your kids.
Right.
Right? As if that's not a job or something.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. Right. So there's the win-lose thing. And what's interesting is that, like, when I think about that from a real estate perspective, is that there's this sort of neutrality that I have to play. Someone, you know, who's responsible for managing that conversation has to play. Because usually one person takes the lead on things like this. You know, even when they're buying, like, yeah, they both want the home, but as soon as you start getting into it, one person takes the lead on this, right? And we'll get into money stuff later, but even throughout the course of owning the home, one person usually takes the lead on the money. And so when you're going to sell a home, usually one person wants to take the lead on selling the home too. And there's this real fine line you have to play of being effective and being efficient, but making sure that I'm neutral.
Right. And whereas my job, I'm not neutral, we try to
Right.
make the real property sale part of a divorce as neutral as possible. And typically what attorneys do is each party provides a list of their top 3 agents. And then they go through and they start picking. So we try to make it neutral so that we avoid situations like that where, oh, one spouse picked the agent. Can you trust that agent?
Right. And then the trick with that is that, well, and it rarely, I'm sure, is the case where they both want the same one, unless there was like a relationship beforehand or they liked it, they were the ones that helped them get the house or whatever, right?
Exactly.
So then you have to kind of have that whole little arbitrating system that happens just with the agent selection. One person's going to feel slighted at least to a 1 percentile degree, 51 to 49.
Right.
And then the whole thing. So the neutrality thing I think is critical of the who wins and loses, because my goal from the real estate side is to try to create a scenario where there isn't really necessarily a winner and a loser, which is completely different from your situation. I want to make sure that both people win.
Right.
Right? So in order to do that, you're going to make sure that you're communicating with both of them in the same exact manner, which can be challenging because one person's texting you something, you want to just text them back as if it's a unified front, but you have to stop, do a group text.
Right. Include everybody.
Include everybody.
Right.
If it's an email, it's the same kind of thing. So it's an exhausting deal to have to basically be serving 2 masters throughout the entire transaction of making sure that's the case. So at the end, someone doesn't feel like there's a winner and a loser.
Right. And you're dealing with very like emotional people, hurt feelings, so it's hard.
Right. So if maybe win-lose is sort of the first one there, the next one I think has to do with speed. Now, this is an interesting one, right? Because like I said earlier, there's usually somebody who wants it fast, done fast, and there's somebody who wants it maybe not done at all, but at the very least slow, right? Now, in your experience, who usually holds either court?
So the spouse that remains in the home until the divorce is finalized wants to take their sweet time and make it take as long as possible, because usually the other spouse is the one paying the mortgage. Typically, the spouse that has left the home has already begun another relationship.
Right.
And they're in a hurry, for obvious reasons, to, solidify the sale and move on, basically. Also, the issue arises of the ability to keep or transfer the house in the other spouse's name. Their credit, would they be able to even transfer the house in the other so that they can take over the mortgage payments?
That's interesting. Yeah. And we're going to get into money in a little bit, but the thing that comes up for me from the real estate side is that most traditional practicing agents love the speed part of it, meaning they really resonate with the fast. As a matter of fact, there's the old joke around our office that our competition basically subscribes to what we call the 4 Ps. They try to convince the seller to price it low so that they can move it quick and look good doing it. Then they put a sign in the MLS, put it up in the MLS, put a sign in the front yard, and then pray it sells. And it's that last one that seems to come at odds a little bit with the whole speed thing, because if the sprint to the front yard and the MLS is the actual prep of the home, it could come at the cost of the actual time it takes to do the transaction, to find a suitor, and then to get through escrow once you actually do find a buyer, and that goes well and all that stuff. And so what we found is that the preparation of the time that's invested before the home ever hits the market is directly proportional not only to how much money they get, but how well the whole thing goes. And again, I keep saying we're going to get to money in a little bit, but the thing that's interesting about divorce, at least from my perspective, when there's a home involved, is that selling the home for the most amount possible is kind of a panacea. Like it helps make a lot of the problems go away when there's a lot of money to divide up.
Right.
Or at least more than they possibly, that whole thing. So it's in everybody's best interest usually to invest the time and it takes to get the home ready for sale, and then to mitigate any of the problems we think are probably going to come in escrow by addressing them in advance. And the two challenges that I find in that, first of all, is that normally one party wants it done quick.
Right.
They want it yesterday.
Right.
And so there's this inclination to just go with like the guy who will say yes to that, and then you're like, like I get that.
Right.
But like there's a cost to that, and they're looking so myopically because it's such a emotionally charged conversation that like they don't want to think that way. It's like you're either on my train or you're on your train. You're trying to railroad this thing through, So there's the speed to the market type of thing, and then there's the who's going to pay for it. Because a lot of times what happens is there's one person who's kind of the money person,
right?
And if they're the ones that want out, there's no money to get it ready, So these are issues that come up, of whether it goes fast or whether it goes slow.
And there are a lot of other issues in a divorce that are contingent on the sale of the house.
Right.
So if you guys are splitting community debt, and the place that you're going to get that money to pay off those debts is from the sale of the house, the sale proceeds, then you really want that to be sold sooner rather than later.
Right. And I know we're talking in and around money a lot here, which obviously is a big part of this conversation, but I think that the respect is, the conversation deserves the respect around talking about kids first.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's a whole custody thing, obviously, which is, supercharged, and I want to hear your take on that as it pertains to the home and who gets the house. For us, though, it's interesting because, the kids thing has so much to do, at least in my role anyway, of keeping things stable, right? So if there are kids involved and they aren't out of the home yet, the ability for us to be able to manage that conversation where as little disruption happens to the kids as possible is our chief goal, right? And I know it's none of our business in that capacity. Like it's almost like it's like a family issue. It's like a family matter kind of thing. So the real estate part of that specifically is that like a lot of times just the sight of the agent in their home makes them upset.
Heartbreaking, right?
We just had this situation last week where there was a single daughter and a single mom left in the same kind of scenario. And as soon as the single daughter, it was a single child, right? As soon as they saw us, she got emotional and she, went to her room. And it was like, that crushed me. Because I just want to be like, no, I'm here to help. But it's like, I get it, because it's her home, and a lot of us have come from families that got broken up. And it's like, you just want to do like a group hug in that moment. But so from us in a practitioner perspective, one of the things that we want to really focus on is how we show up, how we treat the home as a sacred space, how we make sure that we're very thoughtful and compassionate when we are on the property.
Absolutely.
And then trying to be as non-visible as possible while still being like uber effective.
Right. Well, our roles are very similar then, because my role, when we're doing working on a divorce case, that always comes up, is maintaining that consistency that you're talking about. A lot of the times the parent that wants to keep the house or stay in the same house, the number one reason is because of the kids, right? The school down the street is the same school that they've been in for the past X amount of years. Right. They've been in the same district. All their friends are there. Where are they going to go if they do sell the house and leave? And it's disrupting and, harmful to the children.
Right. Yeah. Anything else on that?
That's about it.
Okay.
Custody aside.
Custody aside, right. Which is the whole thing we're intentionally not going
into
this rabbit hole of just trying to keep it about the house. So now let's finally get to the money, can we?
Yeah.
So for the real estate side, obviously it's heavily charged around the money for the same point I just made. Mm-hmm. And it needs to start with proper valuation.
Absolutely.
Right? So, and the reason why I say this and make a point, because it's so obvious. It's like, okay, yeah, get hit with sort of the dumb stick. But the reason why it's so critical is that in a lot of our dealings with folks, there's one person that's responsible for the money stuff. And when I say valuation, I'm not just talking about the agent telling the client how much the home is worth. I'm also talking about making sure that they're super involved in like the documentation process. so that they know how much they owe.
Right.
And this is a weird thing. We actually have documentation as a whole separate issue we're going to talk about under control. But you get focused as a seller on the sale price, but all that really matters to them is the net, how much money they're actually going to get. And in so many situations, there's a disconnect between those two numbers because one party isn't responsible for the numbers or hasn't been throughout the course of the relationship, and they don't really know what that's going to mean for them. So they take a step back in the evaluation process by just thinking that the focus is on the amount of money the agent thinks they can get from the home, when the real question is, what's the net to me?
Absolutely, and I think money is actually crossing over into being proactive and versus reactive, because if you're not keeping all those documents and keeping track of them to be prepared for a situation like this, or at least obtain them in a timely way to go into a divorce,
right,
then so the money and the being proactive definitely go hand in hand. So in terms of money for like my role, it's all about tracing. We have so many different scenarios where people are like, well, I bought the house before marriage, and then
right,
and then the other spouse says, true, he bought the house before marriage, but I contributed from my separate funds X amount to get new granite tops and cabinets. Or, okay, can you trace that money to a separate account? Can you go back? You can't really seek reimbursement without showing that you have the right to reimbursement. And each party in California has a right to be reimbursed unless there is some document which waives that right.
Yeah, and that's the thing, it almost slips into that weird little gray zone where, kind of like a prenup. It's like when you're going through a divorce is the only time in your life where you're like, oh my God, a prenup would have been a great idea. But it's the most unromantic thing ever. Could you imagine getting together, you're in love with somebody, it's romantic, and you're like, hey, before we do this amazing thing, I was just wondering, can you make sure that everything that I basically own stays with me just in case I know it's not going to happen to us and we're going to be.
And it's funny that you say that, because every time I have a consult with a potential client about a prenup, they always say, one more thing, how do I tell him? How do I tell her? Because how do you tell somebody that?
I'm curious.
It's becoming more and more common. I think that's just the trend moving forward, but it's still awkward.
I wonder if there is a corollary between first marriages and second or third or fourth marriages kind of thing. Would you say that's true?
Yes, because you'd always pull the whole card. I got gypped the
right,
last time around, so
right,
can you? Then they'll be more understanding.
Right, allegedly.
Allegedly.
Yeah. So the other thing also, even this has to do with the valuation thing, is that obviously there's a little bit of an indemnity in the sense that there are at least 3 agents you're supposed to talk to, and that there's some kind of community understanding around who is selected and stuff like that, so you feel like you're a part of the process. But I would say even feel comfortable triangulating, right? So don't just rely on the one agent's evaluation that you spoke with. Ideally, you get from a couple different agents as part of the hiring process, so you get a fair idea. And then I would even say, feel comfortable even going a step further. We've had situations in divorces where there's been an appraiser involved. A licensed, corroborated third party, unbiased, completely neutral, at least by design anyway, you'd like to hope so, from the entire conversation, at least if nothing else, to corroborate that the agent that you selected and them were on the same page.
Absolutely. So then don't do Zillow.
Well, there's a cost to that.
I can't tell you how many people have shown up in my office with a Zillow printout. And again, it means nothing without the professionals and
right,
the experts.
Right.
Their input
right,
can't really even begin the negotiation process.
Yeah, and I don't hate on it. I mean, I think that Zillow's the place to start. The mistake is made if they think that that's the place to end.
Exactly.
Right. Right. So there's that piece.
But then who pays for that too? The experts. Somebody has to pay for that.
Well, there's a lot of paying stuff. That's a perfect segue into my next little thing. So, when you talk about executing the plan, right? So this is after everybody's agreed on, all the principles and the idea and what's going to happen. Is there going to be anything done in advance? What's that going to be done? Time frame? Who's going to do it? Who's paying for it? All that stuff. There's this concept we have called the easy button.
Okay.
Right? So, which means that, we have our cadre of people that they're not hired by us, but they're third parties that we've worked with in the past that we trust. So it's almost kind of like our own little version of, the Yelp or the Angie's List or whatever, right? So folks that we would feel comfortable introducing to our folks who can do the stuff. But somebody has to pay for that stuff, right? So the easy button is only easy button if it's funded or monetized.
Exactly.
You know, so then you have this really awkward scenario where you as the agent know what needs to be done, know that if that stuff gets done, it's going to not only fetch more money once it hits the market, but it's also going to mitigate that really uncomfortable scenario when you get into escrow with a buyer in earnest and a number has been negotiated, and then the home inspection comes back and the poor seller gets drug across the coals on all these fixes that need to be done. Usually it ends up costing them about $3 if it gets fixed in escrow to maybe $1 that they would have done if they would have done it on their own before it actually ever went to the market in the first place, right? And there's a whole series of issues why that would be the case. So the funding element with money is that you have to have somebody who is, a couple I would say, right, who's willing to deal with money in a collaborative and investor type of mentality where they're making an investment in the outcome versus a cost. It's just a cost. I don't want any more money. I don't know why I'm going Trump hands on this.
Yeah, but
you know,
it.
like I'm not paying any more money. It's ridiculous. You know, you're just like, but dude, it's gonna, okay.
But you said it, collaborative.
Right.
In a divorce, I mean, that's hard. I guess that's where you come in, right? Because
Well, you
you are
hope-
the neutral, unbiased.
But it's so charged emotionally,
Yeah,
though. It sometimes
exactly.
feels like there's only so much that you can do or that they will allow you to
Right.
do as a partner.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so anything else on the money deal?
Well, just kind of piggybacking off of what you were talking about, who's going to pay for certain things. You know, when you have those prenups that you mentioned, when you have those deeds that transfer, you know, a certain real property under one spouse's name only, there's only one way to go about that, and that's trying to invalidate it. If you now want to say, no, that is my property also, right? Do you know how expensive going to trial over the issue of invalidating a deed or a prenup is? Which is why oftentimes, like at our firm, for instance, we just push for an agreement, a marital settlement agreement. Like, yes, maybe you're right, you didn't understand what you were signing. Maybe, I'm with you. But you know what, in the long run, you know how much you're gonna spend? So why not just reach an agreement, a compromise, and get something out of it?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, that all, so what that kind of bleeds over into the real estate side of stuff is that concept of like after you get going on the deal, there's that like nurturing or comforting element, right? And you might wonder, well, how does that have to apply to the money conversation, like yes money or no money? And I think a lot of it has to do with making sure that both parties feel heard. You know, because you know, we've been in situations where one party in a divorce will remain more silent, and you just think, you know, you're like, God, I wish that person would be more of an active role in this process, but you can't like make that happen.
Exactly.
You know, you're just kind of like, okay, you know, you keep inviting them in, and then all of a sudden there'll be this like explosion, you know, where they will be like, I'm not agreeing to this, or I'm not part, you know, and there's a thing you're like, okay, well, where's that coming from now when you weren't part of all these other little micro choices that led up to the explosion, and now you're blowing the whole thing up.
Right.
And I hear you, but it's almost like it feels, at that point, it almost feels like it's not fair for everyone involved.
Right.
And it goes back to that whole concept of the whole emotional charge and stuff like that. But I think that the offset or the buoy is the nurturing element and making sure that everybody feels like a participant in the process so they feel comfortable. So you don't get to those explosions. And that's a money issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay, good. So here comes the big C word, control. This is a big, big one, right? So kick this off on your side first, because this has way more to do with the upstream element of what happens with your role before it ever even gets to me.
Okay, so I guess from my perspective, we'll look at control in two different ways. When the house has not been sold yet, and when the house has been sold. So when the house has not been sold yet, but there's a divorce pending. Again, usually the couples don't live together. I highly recommend you do not live with the person you're divorcing. Talk about emotions, right? So you have one spouse who stays and one who leaves. That's creating a sense of control. The spouse that has stayed is in control of the residence. Are they going to maintain the residence? Is it a separate property residence that they don't care what happens to it, so they might begin damaging it or ruining it? They have no interest in it and they know that, but they're in control of the house.
Sabotage style.
Right. Then the person who's in control of the money, the mortgage payments, they kind of hold the key as to who's going to maintain this house.
Puns intended.
Right. Exactly. Now, when the house is sold, who controls the money? Typically, it's deposited into a trust account until it's distributed to each party's share is distributed to them.
So escrow, trust account, settlement.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that the big ones for control for me, and I already mentioned this again, but it's that documentation element. A lot of times, reversing that the handicap, of one person not really being part of it enough to know what the facts are before you get into it in earnest. And this is a lot to do with you too, right? Because there's weird games that are played where people hide money.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So again, tracing is really important. You have spouses that say they can't afford the mortgage, but again, they've been funneling money or hiding money into a separate account when in fact they really could afford the mortgage. So
yeah, that's an interesting thing too. And I don't want to, get back onto the money thread too much, but how do you address situations where people intentionally not just sabotage the house, although I could see that happening, but sabotage the money game where they start taking less time at work, or they don't do bonus anymore like they used to always do, where they start kind of cooking the numbers a little bit to get up to a favorable settlement?
Well, you have to show the courts that their earning ability, look at the past years, past tax returns, past earnings, but your best bet again are the experts, right? So a vocational eval by an expert to evaluate what their earning ability really is, what it has been, and the court takes that into consideration.
And I got to imagine also self-employed gets real.
Yeah, that's a little, that's different. That's you would ask for a forensic auditor to go in and look at the accounts and look at the books, and again, very, very expensive.
Yeah.
Very expensive.
Yeah. So what, we frame this almost kind of as questions, and I'm almost curious, if you were worried about having more control or feeling a loss of control, what kind of things would you be looking for specifically, right? So if you're coaching or guiding the client, if for me, if it's get your hands on the documentation, right? So that you know what's actually happening first.
That applies to me too.
And that applies to you too?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Record keeping, obtain the documents somehow, some way. Don't tell me you can't get them. Go to your CPA. Someone has them.
Right.
Someone has them. And if the only person that has them is your ex, well then we do this thing called discovery, where we request it and they have to provide it.
Right. Right. Yeah, the control's a big one. And I feel again, it goes back to that idea of the fact that these are supercharged, transactions, and that everybody needs to feel heard. They need to feel respected. Right. They need to feel like they're part of every decision that takes place in order to have that sense of control. And especially in real estate, because there's so much you can't control in a real estate transaction. We equivocate, it's like the old iceberg theory. It's like that little 15% that's poking out of water. The 85% mass, which is really directing where that berg is floating and what direction it's going, is the part you can't.
Yeah.
So you have to be like a ninja Jedi master about the 15 that's sticking out of water so that you can manage the rest, which you're already basically throwing the raft out and saying that you can't, there's nothing you can do, much you can do about that anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else on that?
On control?
Yeah.
No, besides the fact that everybody wants it. I think people want control more than they want to win and lose. And the reason being is they do go hand in hand, because if you're in control, you're winning, right? And you get to control the speed and the money, so.
You know who famously wanted control?
Many people.
Janet Jackson. That's just a fun fact for everybody back over there. Janet Jackson. Okay, let's move on.
Are you gonna start singing for us?
No. Lastly on the list, this idea of being proactive versus being reactive. Now, this to me is probably sort of part and parcel to the entire conversation, because you could take this and sort of apply it to almost every category that we mentioned, but couldn't be more true in documentation.
Absolutely.
Okay? Couldn't be more true in the valuation.
Absolutely.
Okay? Couldn't be more true in the preparation. It's actually in the name. So the things you're doing before you ever hit the home on the market. The conversations that you're having. Mm-hmm. So like the one-to-one, and this is the thing that's kind of tough a lot of times. We talked about this earlier about making sure there's a continuity of the narrative, that even if you're having a text with one of the parties that everybody else knows,
Is included.
Equally so is a lot of times they don't, the divorcing couple don't like being in the same room together. So we have to have separate consultations with each of them. Each one of those are loaded with critical information and problems being solved and addressed and everything. And so the only way that I know how to do that is to make sure, again, going back to the nurturing element of it, is that before we execute any plan, which is the fifth one, that you have equal face time with each. So if that means doubling up on all the one-on-one conversations that you're having, whether in our office or on their home or in the home of the one we're selling, to make sure that you have the opportunity for everybody to be a co-author in the plan.
And it's really sad that's the case, because think of how productive joint FaceTime would be with everybody there.
Right.
And I find that all the time. Whenever I have a sit down, like a 4-way sit down, wife, husband, and both attorneys, it is the most productive meeting. Instead of doing it separate because they don't want to see each other, and going to the proactive and reactive, right?
But that makes sense though too. So don't lose your thought, because a lot of times though people are intimidated in those situations. Because you can be intimidated. Like they'll act one way when the ex is there in the room, and maybe it's not the truth. Like maybe they'll say what they want the person to hear, but then in their own little separate quarters, they're like, "This is what I really want. This is what I."
But shouldn't there be at least one joint meeting? I mean, okay, maybe start off like that, but at some point you have to put all of your minds together. Because, okay, let me tell you why. So for instance, with divorce, right? A client comes to me and they tell me that, I left the house, I'm making all the mortgage payments, we need to sell it. Okay, have you had a talk with your wife? No. I just sent her a text message, we need to sell the house. I was like, okay, does she know anything about real estate? No. Okay. Maybe it's time for like a coffee sit down, dinner sit down, or an attorney, clients all sit down and show the numbers. Like, look, if we sell the house right now, this is how much you would benefit, how much I would benefit, how much the kids could benefit. But if that talk is not happening and we're going just off of like separate meetings and charged emotions, I feel like sometimes that's counterproductive. So I promote that. In my business, I tell my client, you need to have a sit down. No way, we're not going to coffee together. Okay, come here. Come to my office. Have an attorney come here, and why don't we talk about it?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, true. And I think it's also fair to kind of say that like the coming up with the plan, for me, I think is the critical, we talked about like the neutrality and the nurturing and the comforting once you're in the transaction, and that's not untrue. But if you could almost kind of imagine it like we're talking about this being upstream, the plan is the thing that's furthest upstream.
Right.
And if both people don't feel like they're equal architects in the plan, and the plan's everything. The plan is like the timing, the plan is like with the kids, the plan is, what I mean, that feeling of whether you win or lose at the end, that concept of how the money's gonna get all played out, the feeling of control, like it's all built into the structure of the plan. The execution of that downstream is directly proportional to whether everybody felt like they were equal architects of the plan. The problem, it's just like the medical industry. The problem is not that we don't have tools to fix things. It's the wrong diagnosis of the wrong problem in the first place. So then they run down this whole series of things down here. By the time they get to here, they realize, that's actually not what you have. And now it's too late, even though if they would have, you get what I'm saying. So like that plan part is the critical piece.
And the issue with my job is the problem with the plan is you can't let either party think that it was the other side's plan. You have to somehow let everybody think it was their idea. Because if they feel like this plan wasn't their idea, but they're being forced into it, there will be no progress.
And how can you do that if you're not in the same room?
Exactly.
Right.
It doesn't hurt. You'd be surprised. Sometimes the other spouse, like you said, there's always one spouse that's more in control of the finances and knows more than the other. Usually, not always, right? So sometimes that spouse just doesn't know any better, and all it takes is a sit down to explain to them just how much they could benefit from X plan or whatever.
So, gang, if you can sort of imagine this, right? So the concept being that there is a relationship that's unraveling. There may or may not be all kinds of integrated complexity stacked in it, like money, like kids, etc. But the one thing that's for certain is that there's a house. They own a property together. And what Ronza and I have seen over the course of doing this, I mean, collectively for the last, 2-3 decades? Collectively. We're not that old, gang, right? That the problems are not that the issues are too big to solve in general. The problems are that the issue should have never actually seeded in the first place. If there would have been some forethought to it, if there would have been some, again, prep work in all these arenas in advance of the sign ever going in the yard, metaphorically speaking and actually tangibly speaking, that a lot of these things can get addressed in advance so they don't actually become issues, right? And divorces are hard enough, can we agree on that? They're messy enough. So can we take one thing off that table of messiness by making sure that you're having these conversations, you're getting these 12 questions answered in advance, so that if you are unfortunately having to go through that at least you can take one of these things off the list of memories that went bad during the process, right? Especially when it's so charged because it has to do with kids and money.
Exactly.
Yeah. Parting shots to your fans before saying goodbye?
No, just want to thank everybody for watching and listening, and thank you for having me on the show.
All right, gang. Till next time.